here on opening day, we're very excited, very pleased, very privileged to have Timo Fahler here with us today on this opening day to talk about his exquisite stained glass panel works. I'm going to read a quick bio of Timo and then hand it over to him. But I'm Erin. I know most of you. I'm the chief curator here. Tuesday talks happen at the museum every Tuesday from noon to 1. They're always free. They're always open to the public. We've got a great lineup. Next week, we're going to hear from Paul Baker-Prindle, the director of the museum, who was a co-curator of the main show. And the following week, we'll have Ari Lee, who is the artist in the mini gallery. But today, again, we're super excited to have Timo here. Some of you may remember Timo from last year. He was our keynote speaker for the Abstraction Symposium, kind of blew people out of the water, and so we said, we got to get some of his works in here and exhibit those, and we made it happen. So, Timo is going to discuss his 2002 stained glass works. He uses steel, glass, plaster, wood, and found objects to construct culturally significant works. Combining formal elements of sculpture with visual references to his heritage, Fahler's work explores ideas of home and indigeneity. His practice is inspired by science fiction, historical texts, and comparative mythology, and hones in on his knowledge of labor and craft-based materials to present alternative narratives. So through rebar drawings, glass compositions, and plaster replicas of his body, he invokes familial relationships to manual labor. As a brown artist born in the Midwest, so Tulsa, Oklahoma specifically, Fahler's work celebrates and reconsiders the existence of a multicultural aesthetic in America. Please join me in warmly welcoming Timo Fahler.
Set this here. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. It's an honor to be here, and I actually got to share with Erin earlier that it's been really nice to work with the Klee field. Oftentimes in my line of work, I get the opportunity to interact with different institutions, and it has really been the most kind of fruitful and easygoing experience working with the Klee field, and that can be it's really nice because you can also have the opposite kind of experience with in any way you work, and so it's really nice to feel welcomed and cared for by the museum. So thank you both for providing this space for me and for these works. I'm so honored to have them here. They are part of a series for a show I had called Hope Against Hope in January of 2022 in New York City, and so these are two of a 4-part series. And every time I have an exhibition, I try to take some time afterwards and kind of put some words to paper that kind of act as a way for me to expand the narrative behind the work. And so what I wanted to do is start this talk with this small text that I have that I had written after the show that kind of explains this work and what it means to me. The importance of doing that for each show, I think, will come to fruition later for me. Right now, it's more of a way for me to look at things visually and write down what it is that I am and was thinking, so I can look back in this case, a year from now, and have a new experience with the work, which is really a kind of a beautiful thing to do. So the show was called Hope Against Hope. This work is Tlaloc, Chalchiuhtlicue. I have to speak slowly with these, and the Great Flood. And this one is Tlaltecuhtli and the Creation Myth. So I'm going to talk about 4 works, but I will point to these whenever I talk about them. After the reading, I would love to kind of explain some more things that I'm thinking about as I see these works and get to revisit them, and the hardware and the importance of all of that. but also if anyone has any questions or comments, I'd love for it to be a kind of a discussive conversation as we go. Okay. Hope Against Hope is a group of works that represent my place within the idea of an American dream. The works combine elements of my life, childhood, ancestry, connection, and alienation to culture, family, and locale. The title originally comes from a biblical account of faith against all odds, but is also a part of a recovery narrative that points to wishful thinking. These two sides of thinking are apparent in the dialogue that addresses doom and salvation as a body of work. By combining myth and fiction, the stained glass works dive into a storytelling practice that recreates scenes like the Dust Bowl, the creation story, and the Great Flood. These subjects are both distant and pressing in the dichotomy of the American dream. In hoping for success and possession, I am part of the capitalist machine that I picture my parents and immigrant grandparents embracing, while we are collectively grasping at a dying idea. By integrating literal scenes from my home state of Oklahoma, where I was born, and clashing those landscapes with the cataclysmic dust storm or flood, I am able to decontextualize a narrative that allows me to feel contentment in myself. I am not native to Oklahoma, nor to Mexico as my skin color and family ties would depict, yet I have a natural desire to be tethered somewhere. I have hope in a home that is survivable and even flourishing. We are plagued with a social structure that champions gun violence via arguments of protection, that embraces ownership and private property with disregard to its inhabitants. Hope Against Hope recognizes that part of this current place and time and disembowels former narratives for perhaps a new dream to evolve. Tlaltecuhtli and the creation myth tells of a terra form constructed from gaseous terrain once ruled by a now deadened god. Our world is said to be a result of the death of Tlaltecuhtli. This is her right here. And her body's halves are said to represent the structure of the earth and the sky. The work features a barren, fresh soil, one that is vividly colored and only recently freed from the toxic landscape that it once was. I've used a specific landscape that I grew up seeing, a view from the highway of the eastern part of the state of Oklahoma near the Panhandle. The land is a burnt red that makes the sky an unreal blue in contrast and comparison. As a child, I always imagined the land was what outer planetary terrain must have looked like. The work has two key elements that come from other narratives: a human on a far-off plateau and links of barbed wire across the landscape's foreground. This duality is a nod to the original structure of evolution's creation, a primordial human off in the distance, versus the current structure of private property, our evolved state, giving us some idea of stature through the demarcation act that separates what is mine from what is yours. The second work I'm going to talk about is Tonatiuh, Tulsa, and the Fifth Sun. It takes the central symbol of the Aztec calendar, a depiction of 4 previous ages, and splits it into 2, a nod to the entrance of the foretold fifth and current age. The self-portrait pushes through the split symbol. The storyteller enters, and the story becomes a figure in this age. The narrative goes against my own Christian Midwest upbringing and places me in the age of something I discovered on my own versus that of what I was raised to believe. Tulsa further confuses my understanding of this world. As my birthplace, it is said to be home for me, but has never felt as such. The Aztec-Mixtec legend is where I want to be and what I want to be a part of, but also feels out of reach and unknowable. This is depicted through the face paint on the self, matching that of the sun god Tonatiuh on the disc. I am the dichotomy of selfhood, conflicted yet attached by birth and legend. The story of the mixed-blooded children of an immigrant population is plagued with a contemporary argument of imposter. My blood belongs nowhere, but desires to be connected to some history other than its own or what it is told. Tlaltecuhtli and the Dust Bowl, which is the third work from the series, combines the plague-centered narrative of the Old Testament Bible with a recent geographic history of the Midwest, this landscape specifically taken from the images of the Dust Bowl era in Oklahoma. Known as the god of death, Tlaltecuhtli is used to perpetuate a narrative held by some of the people that lived through the Dust Bowl, a belief that they were cursed due to improper farming practices on the land there. I use an indigenous god of death and destruction to pose the curse as a response not only to the poor land practices of the colonizers, but also as a spirit of retribution for the genocide of a native population that had previously lived on and tended the land the colonizers were guilty of destroying. My blood is that of the colonizer and the colonized. And through this third work, we begin to encounter ideas of hopelessness in spite of my family's encounter with the American dream. Hope against hope has become a perilous fate. Privatization and and capitalism, land grabs and borders drawn, and sideways dreams of being connected while feeling lost culminate into a contemporary cataclysm of fear and abandonment. Tlaloc, Chalchiuhtlicue, and the Great Flood uses both codex and biblical manuscript narratives combined with imagery and objects from my personal life. The work depicts and perhaps anticipates a great flood from the mouth of the historic Tlaloc vessel. Tlaloc is an ancient Mesoamerican water deity, symbolizing ideas of fertility, rebirth, and growth. Combined with the historic Anglo presentation of the Christian flood, I present the convoluted effect of my experience and envision a dream of release that can only be expressed with the purity of a natural catastrophe. The storytelling device of stained glass and codex picture writing begins in the image's center, a flood spilling from the mouth of the water god, washing away moments of our existence. Below the flood, we see skulls and death with a new life of roots sprouting from a fertile soil. So that is the text that I created after the show, using a lot of notes that I took as I was making works for the show. So what I like to do is develop a narrative combined from, as Aaron read, my own history, my own experience with life, as you heard in this paper, biblical texts and mythological texts, historic codex representations from the Central American/Mexican basin, in order to kind of create a new conversation. Using stained glass provides me with a medium that has a lot of sanctity and a kind of a sacred space that I get to encounter. And then I get to then integrate new stories and develop new experiences for the viewer and for myself to have through this kind of sacred presentation. So this would have been the first one that I spoke about and wrote about. And in the narrative of the show, it is the first. It's the creation myth. As you've probably recognized through the text, I grew up in a Christian environment in the Midwest and was taught a very specific creation belief. That I was unaware that anything different could have existed until I became of age where I could kind of think for myself. It's a strange experience that I can only talk about having kind of gone through and changed and shifted through. Being able to have a new belief all of a sudden as a very young 12, 13-year-old, realizing that I had been told a specific story about how life exists, and then all of a sudden have a door open where you realize you can experience so many different things, where there are so many different truths, and those truths are often relative to one's own experience. So we talked about Tlaltecuhtli being split in two halves, which is essentially what I did with the landscape here. The sky and the cosmos came from one half. The earth and the water came from another. So I really wanted to create this beautiful moment that depicted that and had this contrasting landscape. And this is pretty much exactly as I have in my memory of, there was a very specific drive that we would take to my brother's house, and it was the only way to go from our house to his through the Panhandle. And it's almost as though I can picture it right now, just driving past these two plateaus. There's not a lot of mountainous landscape in Oklahoma. So it was a really kind of important landmark for me. And whenever I started to make this work, I really wanted to use that. It's also part of the Cimarron River. So this red dirt comes from a river that flowed through the area 10,000 years ago and eventually kind of moved on and created other waterways in different locations. So, this just becomes a work where I'm able to talk about that. I talked about 2 other works and finished up with this kind of flood narrative work, again referencing the biblical flood, but also taking on Tlaloc and Chalchiuhtlicue. They're both a male and female deity and represent different forms of water's use and representation throughout Mixtec cultures. And so his vessel is where I've brought this mouthpiece out, this like waterway. And then the water itself is a depiction from an image of the female deity Chalchiuhtlicue. She kind of rides, almost surfs like a wave of water that is depicted pretty much in the same way, with the shells coming off of the side, and then there are even certain figures inside of it. What I did was, I think what the artist is actually maybe responsible for, but also there's an opportunity, there's a space for me to kind of tell my own story or tell the story that we are all kind of living. So with this flood, I've got kind of a natural side and a, let's see, like the kind of like personal depicted side, the man-made side. There's a little laptop computer floating here. There are 2 humans that are referencing the original imagery from Chalchiuhtlicue's water skirt. This is my pickup truck. This is like an old church that I encountered when I was a child, but it's also kind of splitting apart from the water. All of these things are meant to be kind of floating in the water. This is my dog. And this is a snake I had a very personal experience with a few years back. There's just a kind of like spiritual reference in that for me. Kind of an uprooted tree, also kind of definitely talking about what a flood does as far as washing things away. But I would say I finished the writing with this really important piece here, which is something that I strongly believe in, and that is birth and rebirth in every narrative. No matter what we tend to believe in, no matter what either dogmatic or spiritual belief I subscribe to, there's always death and rebirth as part of that narrative. And so, with the depiction of the skulls, there's still nutrients that we provide to the earth that kind of continues this cycle of life. So if a flood washes everything away and is a cause for destruction, there's still rebirth evident in that work. That's kind of it. Hopefully there's a few questions or comments or concerns that you might have. I've got a question right here.
Just thinking, is the hanging mechanism sort of intentionally dangerous? I mean, like, I'm just thinking the spike here.
Yeah.
Obviously that was a choice to file that or whatever. And
Yeah.
I'm like thinking about like nails or railroad spikes or other things.
Mm-hmm.
But what was the choice to have that be, potentially menacing?
Yeah.
That's a conscious choice.
Yeah, no, it is a very conscious choice. I think, the experience of presenting a 2-dimensional work and a sculpture in a kind of a 3-dimensional space. In other words, with stained glass, something that I've learned and really wanted to investigate is, stained glass has been used for over 1,000 years and mastered in a lot of different ways. What I really wanted to do as I started to play with the medium was find new ways of presenting and expressing the work. And there are particular times of the day, if the light comes through and shines on these works, or if they're spot in a specific way where the shadow that you're seeing in the back really becomes a lot more aggressive and a lot sharper. So creating different elements that hold the work off the wall is very important to the work. But I also don't want those decisions to be arbitrary. And what I was doing with these specific works is thinking about, actually you can see in the earpiece here, there's piercings in a lot of the different vessels. And piercing was definitely used as a very sacred act within Mixtec societies. Piercing and what's called bloodletting. Bloodletting as a gift, like a human sacrifice, oftentimes. So it's kind of relatable in both of those ways. So it visually acts as a referent to the earpieces and the bloodletting act. But it also kind of does this thing where it, there's an inviting aspect to the glass that is very important to me. But then there's this kind of like, this very visceral experience of that's very sharp. And it's at a very specific level for me in particular, right? And so it's just, there's something to it. I definitely recognize the kind of obtrusive nature. And I remember someone specifically asking me during the show if it's a political act, and I had never thought of it as such. And I guess what they were asking was, is there a personal political action in inviting someone in and then pushing them away at the same time? Like I said, that's not my desire. But there's something very, very inviting to that experience. But also to your experience. I love hearing what other people see. When you brought up railroads and other kind of like visual referentials, like there's a big part of even what Aaron read in my bio, like construction and these types of narratives are very important to me. So the use of rebar steel, like welding these together, finding different types of steel and fabricating these in my studio is all a very important part of the practice. It's something I grew up doing in the Midwest. So it feels not only like really natural to me as an act, but it is kind of giving reverence to labor, and then turning that into a source of fine art.
If I can go again, you were saying that you wrote that piece that you read after the works were done, or after the show was up, or while the show was up.
Mm-hmm.
And you do that as a practice, sort of as to put to language, maybe concisely, kind of the totality of the thoughts that you had when you're making them or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any part of you, as you're creating your work, potentially like you're saying, like this spike, you're kind of thinking, there's something that felt like a visceral, potentially very intentional decision that can reference a lot of things. I don't need to pinpoint it quite yet, I just know it's the right move.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the fact, you're like, okay, now that they're done and I can see them in their totality, I'm gonna put the language to it. Do you feel like you do that in decisions in the works themselves? I also may be making an assumption there, but are there things that you say like, this feels right and I can solidify my language after the fact if I need to?
I think it's a combination of the two. I think it's a really beautiful thing to point out, and for me to revisit this text today and have revisited it 3 or 4 months ago after I wrote it maybe a year ago. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think that this is an experience I get to have for the rest of my life in a way. Each one of these series of works that I create typically has a title, and I like to think of, Aaron mentioned my interest in science fiction. I like to think of all of these different exhibitions and presentations as chapters of a book that continue to unfold, especially the more I get to experience and talk about them, the more I get to revisit them. Just having shown them in the dead of winter New York, 20 degrees out, snow on the ground, and that kind of like gray light experience versus now them living in this space here and having like a new activation and a new life. That's a new chapter for me. That's a new way for me to experience it. So there are definitely little things and little moments, even making this little character here, right? I talked about that nod to kind of like evolution and primordial man and the beginning of life in general. Like those are significant acts. Adding adding the barbed wire that I collected from walking down the street. I knew I wanted to integrate barbed wire into the work. I knew it was important to the concept. I knew it was going to be an ingredient to the overall presentation of the work. I knew I wanted it to be from my neighborhood. So I just walked down the street, found a place where a fence was falling down, and snipped it there, brought it back to the studio, did what I needed to do to clean it up and put it in there. So I think there are pieces of the narrative that are definitely thought about well in advance. And then there's an experience that I get to have months later when I write it down and I get to see like have a closer experience with what is very hope against hope. I try not to feel that hopelessness today, right? I was going through a very specific experience at that time. And right now I'm working on a show titled Shrug Atlas, which is kind of the next chapter, but is also very much like it's stepping out of a sense of hopelessness and is thinking about the Atlas figure like carrying the weight of the world on its shoulder. And it's just like shrug, take a break, relax. Let's the only way we can move forward is to kind of like embrace what's happening now and then continue. And so, I don't know if I've answered your question, but yes.
Have you ever had it lit from behind?
Let's see. There is one work that's installed in Miami that has a light, a function of light from both sides. It's actually embedded into a wall. It's a 4x6 foot work. I don't really design them that way, though I have started a painting process, which is much more like the historic kind of church figurine. If you'll notice, like this is all like kind of cut shapes, but when you go to a church, you see the face of Christ painted, and that's where I would use and integrate light from behind a little bit more, because it kind of does this thing that many church windows do, which is like, when you're walking through this space, this like emanating like light of God. The whole point of stained glass in the church is like to have this spiritual experience. Really, really magical. That it's an amazing medium.
How did you learn how to weld?
My dad. Yeah.
I wanted to know.
Yeah.
I learned how to weld from my dad as well, so I wanted to know if that was more of a family connection.
Yeah.
And having that sort of knowledge and labor practice put into this work really adds another layer of effect.
Oh, it definitely does now.
I can see it.
It doesn't. When I was a kid, I have some like a torrid relationship with that. When you're a child and you're like, oh, I don't want to do this. You know what I mean? It's like,
Second generation.
it's much more labor.
It is very labor. Your body is
Yeah.
into it.
Yeah.
And everything. So
Yeah.
when I first saw these pieces, that was one of my first questions. If
Yeah.
you were the one welding.
Yeah, it's very much an homage to that experience. I think I have a lot of respect for the work ethic of my elders, and being able to weld my own work to bend this steel. So pretty much all of this I do in the studio. I start with a very kind of crude drawing, which I didn't bring any, but this would have started as a really just a quick 5-minute sketch. That I then kind of make a little bit more detailed, and then I, create my welded frame and start to take the pencil marks on paper and turn them into lines of steel. So you can imagine, after that is done, you've essentially got a steel frame.
The stained glass, what drew you to that?
Well, I kind of told you about the process of drawing the steel frames and then welding the steel together. As a sculptor, I navigate the lines between abstraction and like figurative work in a very loose kind of way. And so the work previous to this was definitely a little bit more abstract. It was still using these steel frames, but I was using a plaster material and pouring the plaster into the frames and into the drawings, and they would become much more intuitively abstract. Even if I had a specific drawing and a specific idea, it was kind of about washing that away. And what happened is, I think around 2017, 2018, I made a switch to this work that was a little bit more representational, because number one, I wanted to see through those works. So I knew I could go to either resin or glass. I had experience with glass, so I wanted to start that. Number two, I felt like I was starting to feel a little too safe in abstraction. And I wanted to continue to have abstract conversations, but allow the work to go in a new direction and to, have some tough conversations, I think, that I was grasping in my own inner narrative, and then have this kind of text required of me, rather than like, I just felt like abstraction wasn't saying what I needed to say.
Okay, we've been through the abstraction, we've been through the emotion, we've been through the whys. How long, logistically, how long did the concept take longer, or the actual doing it?
They kind of work hand in hand. In other words, I can't make the works without the concept. That's something I was just telling a fellow artist the other day, that it's like what I've been trying to work on is to stay ahead, let's say conceptually. In other words, I think as artists, we kind of like really dive into one idea and really dive into that type of presentation for the work. But I'm not the type of person that, and the reason I mentioned that it took almost 10 months to make this show at least, is because I don't go in day one with, okay, here's 4 drawings of the work that I want to make for this small series, and then 2 others. I'm drawing on my own recent history as far as the works that I've made previous to these. I'm thinking about the different subject matter that I want to depict in the show. I'm thinking about a title. So all of these things are jumbling together, and oftentimes it's like piece number 1 leads to piece number 2. And if piece number 1 and 2 are speaking to me, then maybe I can get to piece number 4 and 5 without even having to go through the narrative or through a numerical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's almost as though this happens with anything. I run a lot, and the more I run, the more equipped I am to run. With these works, and when I'm starting a new series, at first it can be a little bit, it's probably the most difficult part of the phase, the early production part of the phase, because I'm asking so many questions of myself, and so many questions of the work, and so many questions of the content and the concept, and what the end result will be. And I find the most freedom in sometimes just letting go and allowing something to present itself. And then all of a sudden that narrative starts to come into fruition. So I wish there was a definitive answer that could tell you one versus the other, but it's often a full narrative that has to be developed in order to get there.
I'm just curious, do you get conditions where somebody asks you to do a certain kind of painting, or you're always left to make up your own concept?
I would say 90% of the time I'm left to make up my own concept. If I've had an experience where someone was really interested in a group of works that I had at a show that were all spoken for at a museum show in Tucson, and I wasn't done talking about the narrative. And so that type of commission was essentially them saying, like, I love this work. Are there more works you have planned for this? And so that's kind of like the closest experience I've had to a commission. There are so many people that do stained glass, that the experience of working the way that I get to work allows me to kind of continue to have, even though all these are telling a different story, I feel like there's so much more to get out there, and I'm really busy trying to tell that story, that even if it was financially beneficial to me, it would be really hard for me to stop and do this landscape that someone really wants. That said, I have a family to take care of, right? And so I have to be aware of when those things are presented to me, like how I'm taking care of that family.
I have a question. So one of the reasons we wanted to display stained glass works here is because of our skylight, right? To watch the sun sort of traverse across the works and see how the light activates them and the image behind, right? The double image that they create on the wall, to see it shimmer, right? As you described this experience of stained glass in churches, it's this kind of very magical experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that it allows us to return to the work over and over again, to experience it differently, not just throughout the day, but experience it differently in different weather, right? In different seasons and so forth. So I'm very curious about whether or not that was a super conscious decision on your part, if it's kind of a happy accident, if you're thinking about these specifically as temporal works that are related to, say, the seasons changing, the passage of the sun, and so forth.
I wish I could say that, that I had all of it planned out from the beginning when I first chose this pane of glass to use in this specific work. It's been a much more magical unfolding experience to me, to where I've been able to not only see the importance of the medium, but also the importance of the surrounding moments, not only physically and politically and what's going on in the world, but like you said, what's going on in the weather, what's going on in the light in the room versus the synthetic light that exists, and how those shadows differ and change. Yeah, but having natural light experiences with these works is definitely one of my favorite ways of talking about them. In other words, if I could list, when I list the mediums of steel, barbed wire, stained glass, sunlight, if I could list that as a medium, because the projection becomes so important to the work, because there's, again, like you said, it's almost as though I get to think about the two-dimensional work, the three-dimensional sculpture, and then a fourth-dimensional projection that kind of gives it a different life altogether.
Will you continue to work in glass indefinitely?
I plan to. I think that over the past 10 years in practicing art and creating work, I have essentially, you just kind of keep a pocketbook of mediums and pull some out here and there and integrate them into the work and into the story, and then put them down for a little while and move into something else. My first time touching glass, it was a different type of working, but it was called lamp working, and it was in 2002 in San Diego when my cousins taught me how to do that type of work. So, I think that there's different experiences that I'll be able to have with it, but I can't imagine, I'm not the type of artist that would just step away and say, I'm doing this now.
Do you ever paint on the glass?
I,
When I'm looking at this, it almost looks like you painted on it.
yeah, that is something that I have actually recently just begun to teach myself, painting on stained glass. I did not do it for these works, but this next series that I'm producing at the moment has some moments where I've started to work with the painting on stained glass. I really enjoy that. I think it's an interesting way of also telling a story. But I think that oftentimes there's I feel weird saying there's a battle with the masters. Like I said, stained glass is over 1,000 years old, and they've been doing really well. I don't want to just make a little drawing on stained glass painting and be like, here's my contribution. It's like that you really have to kind of think about what you're doing and how you're presenting it out of respect for a tradition.
Any more questions? All right, well, these works will be up through the end of the semester. Thank you so much, Timo.
Thank you.
As I said, I do encourage folks to come back and experience them as the months progress, as we get more light in here and see them at different times of day.